Welcome to our deep dive today. We're tackling a topic you've asked to explore: flexible working arrangements, or FWAs for short. We're going to be looking at how they function, what benefits they have, what challenges they bring, and how to make them work well. And to help us unpack all of this, we'll be diving into a fascinating source, the International Review of Industrial and Organizational Psychology, Volume 18. Buckle up. This is going to be an insightful deep dive.
Oh, for sure. It's a really rich area of study, and there's a ton of research out there on FWAs, but I think also still so much to learn, so many nuances.
Definitely. And let's start with something basic. I think it's good to clarify exactly what we're talking about when we say FWAs. I mean, a lot of people think it's just working from home a couple days a week.
Right, yeah, and it's definitely more than that. It's really anything that sort of deviates from that traditional 9 to 5 in the office setup.
Yes.
So that could be, like you said, working from home, but also things like compressed work weeks.
Oh, yeah, like fitting 40 hours into 4 days.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or staggered hours where not everyone on the team starts and ends at the same time. Or even job sharing, where you have two people kind of splitting one full-time role.
So it's really about giving employees more control over, I guess, their work schedules and also their locations.
Exactly.
And the source we're looking at today highlights some pretty impressive potential benefits for companies. We're not just talking about like happier employees, but actual like bottom line improvements.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So the research suggests that FWAs can lead to things like faster product launches, higher quality output from those products, and even more responsive customer service.
Really?
Yeah. And there's this great study by Kosick and Ozeki, and they actually did this meta-analysis, and they found that FWAs were more strongly linked to these kinds of positive work-related outcomes than even traditional dependent care measures.
What do you mean by dependent care measures?
So things like on-site childcare. So they saw a stronger link between these FWAs and things like, job satisfaction, performance, those kinds of things. Wow, that's fascinating. But I'm guessing it's not all, like, perfect and easy, right? There's got to be some downsides. What are some of the challenges this source brings up?
Well, one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that positive outcomes aren't like 100% guaranteed.
Right, because just because a company offers it doesn't mean it's going to automatically work well.
Right, exactly. And actually, some of the research findings are pretty inconsistent.
Interesting.
Yeah. And one area where this is especially apparent is the potential for gender disparities.
Right, because even if a company offers flexible work, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone can take advantage of it equally.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And so there's these studies by Sullivan and Lewis, and what they found is that women, especially when they're working from home, are more likely to end up multitasking. And they're also less likely to have a dedicated workspace.
Which makes sense, right? Even if you have those flexible hours, if you're constantly switching between like work tasks and, family responsibilities or, household tasks, it's going to be hard to really focus and be productive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it's almost like, without being careful, these FWAs could unintentionally kind of reinforce existing inequalities, which really makes me think about the role of managers. I feel like that's a really important piece of this whole thing, and it's something that the source really emphasizes.
Oh, yeah. Managers are super important for sure.
Yeah.
Because it's not enough to just have a flexible work policy.
Mm-hmm.
It's really managers have to kind of like model and shape the culture around how these arrangements work.
Because if you have a manager who says, everyone take advantage of these FWAs, but then they're always working late themselves, that sends a really mixed message.
Exactly, exactly. And, actions speak louder than words, right?
Totally.
Hmm.
And there's this interesting study mentioned in the source that was done in Scotland by Bond and his colleagues, and they found that a lot of managers would acknowledge the value of FWAs for their employees, but then at the same time, they would be working like excessive hours themselves.
Yeah.
It's like, what kind of example is that setting for the team?
Exactly. It kind of creates this expectation, even if it's not explicitly stated, that everyone needs to be on all the time.
Right. So it sounds like a successful FWA strategy requires more than just, checking off boxes and having a policy in place. There has to be like a real culture shift, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And that has to start from the top.
Totally. And this actually brings us to another really interesting point that this source kind of makes. They talk about the research methodologies themselves and how maybe relying just on those like traditional measures like productivity or absenteeism, it might be too limiting.
Interesting. So what do they suggest instead?
So they point to the work of Balin and some other researchers who are using this thing called action research. And it's not about just measuring those predetermined outcomes, but it's about actually working with companies to solve specific problems that they're facing.
So it's less about proving a hypothesis and more about finding a solution that works in the real world.
Exactly, exactly. And it's a much more collaborative approach.
And I bet that leads to some pretty unexpected insights too, right?
Oh, for sure. So, for example, Balin did this research on the dual agenda, and it was all about balancing company goals with the well-being of the employees. And, they found that these FWAs actually led to improvements in things like, time to market, product quality, all these things they weren't even initially looking at.
Wow. So it's almost like a whole new way of thinking about FWAs, right? Not just as this like perk for employees, but like this strategic tool. And I'm sure what we've covered so far is already sparking some thoughts for you listening.
Oh, definitely. And, what stands out to you? What are you thinking about so far? Hold on to that thought because we'll be digging even deeper in part two.
Welcome back. Ready to keep exploring these flexible working arrangements? It's a topic that just keeps getting more interesting the deeper we go. Yeah, for sure. I feel like we've already uncovered so much from the different types of FWAs out there to all those potential benefits, but also some of those challenges. Like we talked about the possibility of FWAs, maybe making those gender gaps even wider and the really critical role managers play in all of this.
Absolutely. And, as you're listening, I'm sure you're making those connections too, to your own experiences in your own workplace. What's resonating most with you so far?
Yeah, we always want you to be an active participant, not just, passively listening. So building on that, I think it's worth going back to that point we touched on about FWAs potentially widening those gender gaps.
Yeah, it's a crucial thing to consider, for sure. Because, like, on the surface, it seems like, more flexibility would lead to more work-life balance for everybody. But, as we've seen in the research, sometimes women face those extra hurdles that might prevent them from actually getting the same benefits as their male colleagues.
Right. And our source, that International Review of Industrial and Organizational Psychology, brought up some, pretty stark research about this. Like those studies from Sullivan and Lewis, I was really struck by that, showing how women working from home, they're more likely to be multitasking and less likely to have that dedicated workspace.
And it's not even just about having a home office, right? It's also, even today, there's still this societal expectation
Yeah.
that like women are still primarily responsible for all those, childcare and housework duties.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So even if you have those flexible hours, if you're constantly switching gears between like work tasks and family needs, it's just going to be hard to really get into that focused flow state.
It's like almost, if we're not careful, instead of breaking down those traditional gender roles, these FWAs might accidentally reinforce them.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
it just really underscores how important it is to be really thoughtful and nuanced when it comes to implementing these arrangements. You can't just offer those flexible options and call it a day. Companies really need to be proactive in trying to like anticipate those unintended consequences.
So what are some things that, organizations can do to try to make sure that these FWAs are actually equitable and benefit everyone, regardless of gender?
Yeah, and that's something that, researchers are really grappling with right now. And there isn't like a one-size-fits-all solution, but some interesting strategies are definitely emerging. And one thing that comes up again and again is this idea of like providing more robust support and resources for childcare.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, because that could really be like a game changer for working parents, especially for mothers who, tend to bear the brunt of those responsibilities.
Right, right. So, thinking practically, like having on-site childcare facilities or maybe providing subsidies for external care or even just being more flexible with scheduling
Yeah,
to accommodate those, school drop-offs and pickups, that could really help level the playing field.
totally. But it goes beyond just like that logistical support,
Yeah.
right? It's also about, creating this culture where work-life balance is genuinely valued for everyone.
Yeah. And that means kind of actively pushing back against that whole always on mentality and,
Yeah.
and promoting like a more results oriented approach to work.
Exactly, where your value isn't tied to like how many hours you're physically present, but what you actually
Yeah.
accomplish.
And managers, again, play a key role in this, right? Because they
Yeah.
need to like really walk the walk,
Totally.
model those healthy work habits, set realistic expectations, and just really challenge any of those like unspoken norms that might penalize employees for, particularly women, for prioritizing their personal lives.
Yeah. And it's about creating that environment where people feel psychologically safe
Yeah.
to actually
Wow.
take advantage of those flexible work options.
Yeah. Without feeling like they're going to be judged or like penalized in their careers.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember, too, that, like, flexibility, it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing.
Of course not.
What works for one person might not work for another, and people have such different needs and preferences.
So offering a range of flexible work arrangements is really key, and allowing employees to choose what works best for them.
Absolutely. And it's super important that those choices are available to, like, everyone in the organization,
Oh, for sure.
not just certain departments or certain levels,
Yeah.
because otherwise it's like you're creating this two-tiered system,
Right.
which can lead to resentment and that sense of unfairness.
It sounds like transparency and equity are just like absolutely crucial to making those FWAs work over the long term. Now, I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and talk about another aspect of this. Like, how do FWAs affect communication and collaboration within teams?
Oh, yeah. That's a big one. Like, can teams really be effective if they're not always physically together?
Right. And this is a really hot topic, especially now with the rise of, all that remote work and those hybrid models. And the research is kind of all over the place, right?
Yeah.
Like, some studies say that virtual teams can be just as productive, if not more so, than those traditional co-located teams. But then others say, watch out for those pitfalls like miscommunication, people not feeling as connected, and just the difficulty of building trust when you're not face to face.
It's a tricky one. And I think, what it really comes down to is understanding the specific factors that kind of tip the scales one way or the other. So, like, what kind of work are they doing? What are the personalities and the dynamics within that team? And what tools and processes are they using to actually communicate and collaborate?
And our source, the international review, doesn't really go super deep into this specific area, but there's a lot of other research out there about virtual teams that we can draw from.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And a lot of that research suggests that, for those virtual teams to really thrive, they need things like, really clear communication protocols, frequent check-ins, and technology that actually facilitates real-time collaboration.
So it's not just about having Zoom and Slack, it's about using them well and with a purpose.
Exactly. But those tools are just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
You've got to have that strong team culture, even in a virtual setting. Things like, encouraging social interaction, maybe virtual team building activities, opportunities for that informal communication. Those can all really help build rapport and trust, even if you're not in the same physical location.
It's funny. It's almost like you have to work harder to build those connections when you're not just, bumping into each other at the office every day.
Yeah.
Which I think brings us to another really important point, the need for really clear expectations and boundaries when it comes to those FWAs.
Yeah, that's absolutely key, both for the employers and for the employees. Without clear guidelines, these arrangements can really easily lead to, like, confusion, resentment, even burnout.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, employees really need to know what's expected of them. How available do they need to be? How quickly do they need to respond? What kind of output are they expected to produce? And all that has to be clear, even if their schedule is flexible.
Right. And on the flip side, employers have to respect those boundaries that employees set, right?
Totally.
Just because someone's working from home doesn't mean they're available 24/7.
Exactly. It's definitely a two-way street. Both sides really need to be mindful. They need to communicate to make sure those flexible arrangements are sustainable and they actually benefit everyone. And it's not like something you can just set and forget,
Right.
because needs change, expectations change, so checking in and making those adjustments regularly is really important.
So in a way, you're building flexibility into the structure of those flexible work arrangements. Now, we've talked a lot about like the potential problems, but we can't forget about all those positive impacts those FWAs can have on organizations.
That's right. We often talk about, how they benefit the employee, their well-being, and their work-life balance, but they can really have a huge impact on that bottom line too.
And our source, the International Review, talks about that how FWAs can improve time to market, enhance the quality of products, and lead to more responsive customer service.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes down to those FWAs, boosting employee engagement and motivation.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like when people feel valued and trusted, when they feel empowered to manage their work in a way that works for them, they're just going to be more productive, creative, and committed to that company's success.
It makes sense. And it's not just intuition. Like the research actually backs this up. And it really drives home this idea that, FWAs aren't just some fluffy perk. They can actually be a strategic advantage.
Absolutely. But, it doesn't happen automatically.
Right.
Organizations have to be strategic about it. They have to be deliberate in their approach if they want to see those benefits, because just offering those flexible options without thinking about how they'll impact those workflows,
Uh-huh.
communication, and team dynamics, it can actually backfire.
Oh, for sure.
You might end up seeing less productivity and more stress.
It's about like striking that right balance, isn't it? Offering the flexibility, but also making sure the work gets done well and efficiently. And that means careful planning, clear communication, and like you said, continuous evaluation.
You got it. It's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious, what's standing out to you? What are your thoughts? What new insights are you walking away with?
Welcome back. We're at the final part of our deep dive into these flexible working arrangements. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've really explored all those different angles, those gender challenges, how virtual teams can make it work, and how companies can really use those FWAs to their advantage.
Yeah, it's been great. So before we wrap up, I'm just curious, what are your biggest takeaways? What's really stuck with you? What are you thinking about now in terms of FWAs in your own work?
We always love hearing your thoughts. We share these insights, but it's all about how you connect them back to your world and how you might apply them.
Exactly. So to kind of round out our exploration, let's go back to our main source, the International Review of Industrial and Organizational Psychology for a minute. And one of the things that really struck me was how they were calling for it, like a much more nuanced and context-specific approach to actually researching those FWAs.
Yeah, they made a good point. Just measuring those traditional outcomes like, turnover rates or how much work gets done might not really tell the whole story.
Exactly. Like, how are those FWAs actually playing out in all those different organizations?
Hmm.
And they're really advocating for this more action-oriented approach. So it's about working with companies directly, really getting to understand their specific needs, their challenges, and then designing and evaluating those FWAs right there in that real-world context.
Oh, that makes me think about what we were talking about earlier with Balin's research, the dual agenda and how to find those win-win solutions.
Yes, exactly. They were using that action research approach, and they found some really cool things. Like they found that those FWAs could actually lead to things like faster time to market and better product quality. And they weren't even initially looking for those things,
Right.
but they were working so closely with that company, they were able to observe those like unexpected
It
benefits.
really shows how important it is to have that collaboration between researchers, people who are actually doing the work, and the employees themselves.
Right. It's not just about the academics like figuring it all out on their own, but actually getting everyone involved in the conversation.
Exactly. And finding those solutions that work for everyone. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think a good question to leave everyone with is, thinking about your own workplace, your team, your own career goals. What can you do to create a more flexible and supportive environment?
One that doesn't just benefit those individuals, but helps the whole organization move forward. It's a question to really think about, talk about with your colleagues, even bring up with your leaders. The future of work is changing, and those FWAs are going to play a huge part in how that all unfolds.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into flexible working arrangements. Hopefully you found it insightful, made you think a bit, and maybe even inspired you to make some changes.
Keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep pushing for a workplace that really works for everyone.